I've been in love with him since the day I decided to hate him. I read the line 3 times before it actually made sense, and even then, it didn't. Not really. Not in any way that fit the version of reality I had been living in for the past 6 years, because if there was one thing I knew with absolute certainty, it was that Lucas Hayes hated me, not casually, not indifferently, but with a precise, deliberate kind of coldness that felt personal, like he had chosen me specifically to dislike, like it was a decision he woke up and recommitted to every single morning. And yet here I was, standing alone in the back corner of the campus library, holding a worn leather notebook that I had absolutely not meant to take, flipping through pages that were filled with neat, controlled handwriting that somehow made my chest feel too tight, too warm, too something I didn't have a name for, because my name was in it, over and over again, like a pattern I couldn't unsee once I noticed it, like every page circled back to me no matter how much I wished it didn't. And the worst part was, it wasn't written like someone describing a person they hated. It was written like someone trying very hard not to say something they couldn't afford to admit out loud. And I should have stopped reading right there. I should have closed it and walked away and pretended none of this existed. But my fingers didn't listen. They kept turning pages, slow at first, then faster. Like I was afraid if I hesitated too long the words would disappear or change into something safer. Something easier to ignore, but they didn't. They stayed exactly as they were, honest in a way that felt almost invasive, like I had stepped into a version of Lucas Hayes that no one else was ever supposed to see. Not the guy who rolled his eyes every time I spoke in class. Not the one who cut me off mid-sentence during presentations like my opinions were background noise. Not the one who looked at me like I was something mildly inconvenient that he tolerated at best. No, this version of him. Noticed things, small things, ridiculous things, like the way I always tapped my pen twice before writing, like how I pushed my sleeves up when I got nervous, like how I laughed a little too loud when I didn't know what else to do. Details that no one should have been paying attention to, least of all him, and my stomach twisted in a way that made it hard to breathe, because suddenly every memory I had of him started replaying in my head, but wrong, like someone had taken the same scenes and shifted the meaning just slightly out of alignment. Like maybe that time he stayed late after class wasn't just because he had extra work. Maybe that look he gave me across the hallway wasn't irritation. Maybe it was something else entirely that I had never even considered, and I hated that thought. I hated it so much because it meant I had been wrong, completely, embarrassingly wrong about something I had built my entire understanding of him around, and I didn't know what to do with that, didn't know what it meant, didn't know what it changed, except that it changed everything. Because if Lucas Hayes didn't actually hate me, then what exactly had I been feeling all this time when he looked at me like that? And why did my chest feel like it was about to crack open just from reading words he never meant for me to see? I should have stopped at the first page, but I did not. And that was the problem, because once I started, I could not unread any of it, could not unsee the version of Lucas Hayes that existed in ink instead of real life. And the more I read, the less the past 6 years made sense in the way I remembered them, because the entries were dated, carefully marked like he needed structure to contain whatever this was, and they went back further than I expected, all the way to our junior year of high school, which was the year everything between us had started to feel sharp and personal and impossible to ignore. The year he began correcting me in class with that clipped tone that made everyone laugh just enough to sting. The year I decided he was insufferable and never bothered to question it again. But his version of that same year read differently, like a parallel timeline I had never been invited into. And my eye snagged on one line that made my fingers tighten around the edge of the page. He answered the question before I could. I said something dismissive so no one would notice I was impressed. And I actually let out a small, disbelieving laugh that echoed too loudly in the quiet aisle. Because that day was burned into my memory for entirely different reasons. I remembered the way my face had heated, the way I avoided looking at him afterward, the way I told myself he just enjoyed making me feel small. And now I was staring at proof that I had been standing inside the wrong story the entire time, and it did not stop. There, it got worse, or maybe better, I still could not decide, because every few pages there was another moment I recognized. Another interaction I had filed away under proof that he did not like me, rewritten with this quiet, restrained honesty that made it impossible to dismiss as a joke or a passing thought. He was laughing with someone else today, and I hated how easy it looked. He left his notebook behind, and I kept it for an hour before returning it, because I wanted a reason to talk to him. I think he thinks I cannot stand him, and maybe that is easier than explaining why I cannot seem to look away, and my chest felt tight again, like something inside me was trying to rearrange itself too quickly, because none of this matched the Lucas I knew, the one who barely acknowledged me unless it was to challenge me, the one who made eye contact feel like a competition I always lost, the one who never, not once, gave any indication that I mattered in any way beyond being a convenient target for his irritation. And yet here was line after line of quiet attention, of noticing, of holding back, of choosing distance over something else I could not quite name, and it made my head spin because if this was true, if any of this was real, then it meant every look, every comment, every moment I had brushed off as dislike might have been something else entirely, something I had not been equipped to recognize at the time, and I pressed the notebook closed for a second, breathing in slow through my nose like that would somehow ground me, but it did not, because the weight of it was still there in my hands, solid and undeniable, and I knew I was not done, not even close, even though a part of me was already panicking at what the rest of it might say, at what it might force me to feel, at what it might reveal about him, and, worse, about me, because if he had been pretending all this time, then what exactly had I been doing in response? And why did it suddenly feel like I had been the one missing something obvious all along? The next page was worse because it was recent enough that I could remember exactly where I had been standing, what I had been wearing, what I thought he had been thinking when it happened, and now I was staring at the same moment through his words instead of mine, and it did not line up at all. He sat 2 rows ahead today and did not look back once. I told myself that was good. Easier. It was not. And I felt that one somewhere uncomfortably deep because I remembered that day too clearly, the way I had deliberately taken a seat farther away because I was tired of feeling like I was under a microscope whenever he was around, tired of trying to decode the way he spoke to me like everything I said needed to be corrected, and I had told myself distance was better, that not having to deal with him was a relief. Except apparently he had noticed that too. Except apparently it had not been nothing, and I turned the page faster than I meant to, like I could outrun the feeling building in my chest, but the next entry caught me just as hard. He smiled at someone else today. I made a comment about his presentation being sloppy, so I would not have to think about why that bothered me. And I actually had to stop breathing for a second because that presentation had been one of the few times I felt confident, one of the few times I thought I had done well, until he cut in with that calm, precise critique that dismantled half my argument in front of everyone. And I had walked out of that classroom convinced he just enjoyed taking me down a notch, convinced he liked seeing me stumble, and now I was holding proof that it had never been about that it had been about something messier, something quieter, something he had never let show in any way that would have made it easier to understand, and it made my stomach twist, because if he had felt like this, then why had he never said anything? Why had he let it play out like this for years? Why had he chosen distance and sharp words and controlled indifference instead of something honest, something that might have saved both of us from whatever this was? And I flipped again, slower this time, almost careful, like I was afraid of what I would find but unable to stop myself from looking. And there it was, the entry that made everything else tilt just slightly out of balance. I think he believes I hate him now. I should fix that. I will not. And I let out a quiet breath that felt more like something breaking than something steady. Because there was no joke in that, no sarcasm to hide behind, just a decision, clear and intentional. And that was somehow worse than everything else, because it meant this was not an accident, not a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control. It was something he had seen happening and allowed anyway, something he had chosen to keep in place even when he knew exactly how it looked from my side. And I closed the notebook again, but this time I did not move, did not step away, did not pretend I could just put it back and walk out of here like none of this mattered. Because it did matter. It mattered in a way I did not know how to process yet. In a way that made every interaction we had ever had feel unstable, like the ground under it had been different all along. And my fingers tightened around the cover as I stared down at it, trying to reconcile the version of Lucas Hayes I had known with the one who had written all of this in quiet, controlled lines. And for the first time since I picked it up, a different thought slipped in, quieter but sharper, cutting through everything else. If he had known I thought he hated me and still chose to keep pretending, Then what exactly was he so afraid of that this felt like the better option? My first instinct was to put it back exactly where I found it, to slide it onto the shelf like nothing had happened and walk out of the library with my version of reality intact, cracked but still technically standing, but my feet did not move, and my hands did not let go. And that was the part that scared me the most, because it meant this mattered more than I wanted it to. It meant I could not just unknow it. And I hated that feeling, hated the way my thoughts kept circling back to him, too. Every look I had misread, every word I had taken at face value without ever questioning what might have been underneath, and I told myself to stop, to breathe, to think logically for 1 second, because there had to be an explanation that did not involve rewriting 6 years of history in my head. There had to be a version of this where I was not the last person to understand what was happening between us. But the problem was, the evidence was still sitting right there in my hands, quiet and undeniable, and no matter how many times I tried to reframe it, it did not change what was written on those pages. It did not change the way his words felt too deliberate to be a joke, too consistent to be a phase, and I pressed the heel of my palm against my forehead, closing my eyes for just a second like that might somehow reset everything. But all it did was make the memory sharper, clearer, louder, and suddenly I could see it. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to make my stomach twist, enough to make my chest feel too tight again, because there had been moments, small ones, easy to dismiss at the time, but harder to ignore now, like the night it started raining after a late study session, and I realized I had left my jacket in the lecture hall, only to find it folded neatly over the back of my chair the next morning, even though I was sure I had not gone back for it. Or the time my laptop died right before a deadline, and someone had quietly emailed me the notes from the lecture I missed without any explanation, no name attached, just a file that showed up exactly when I needed it, and I had brushed both of those off as coincidences, as things that just happened, because it had been easier than considering that Lucas Hayes might have been involved in anything that made my life easier instead of harder, and now those moments felt different, heavier, like they had been pointing at something I had refused to see, and I opened my eyes again, staring down at the notebook like it might offer answers if I looked at it long enough, like it might explain why he would choose to act like this, why he would build this careful, controlled distance when everything he wrote suggested the opposite. And that same question from before came back, sharper this time, less abstract and more personal. What was he so afraid of? And why did it feel like I was suddenly part of the answer whether I wanted to be or not? And that was when I heard it, the soft, familiar sound of footsteps approaching from the end of the aisle, steady, unhurried, unmistakable, and my entire body went still before my brain could catch up, because I knew that sound. I had heard it too many times not to, and the realization hit me all at once, cold and immediate. Lucas was here, right now, and I was standing in the middle of a quiet library, holding something I was never supposed to see. The sound of his footsteps did not rush, did not hesitate, just steady and inevitable, like he had all the time in the world, and I was the only one suddenly running out of it. And for a split second my brain scrambled for something simple, something easy, like just putting the notebook back and pretending I had never touched it, but my hands did not cooperate. They stayed exactly where they were. Fingers curled too tightly around the cover, like letting go would somehow make everything worse. And I hated that because it meant I was already too far in, already past the point where I could act like this was nothing. And then he turned the corner of the aisle and stopped. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just a pause that felt heavier than it should have, like the air itself had shifted around us, and for a second neither of us said anything. We just looked at each other, and I realized with a sharp, uncomfortable clarity that this was the closest we had ever stood without some kind of barrier between us. No classroom desk, no hallway crowd, no shared group project forcing polite distance, just open space and a silence that stretched long enough to feel intentional. And his eyes dropped, not to my face, not to the space between us, but directly to the notebook in my hands. And I watched the exact moment he understood, because something in his expression changed, not completely, not enough that anyone else might have noticed, but I did, because I had spent years learning how to read the smallest shifts in him just to stay one step ahead of whatever comment he was about to make. And this was different. This was not irritation or quiet judgment or that familiar cool detachment. This was something tighter, something more controlled, like he had just locked something down before it could show too much. And the silence stretched another second, then another, until it started to feel like a choice, like he was giving me time to say something first, to explain, to deny, to do anything that might make this less obvious than it already was. But I could not find the words, could not decide which version of the truth would even make sense here. Because what exactly was I supposed to say? That I had accidentally taken his notebook and then accidentally read enough of it to completely dismantle everything I thought I knew about him. That I had stood here long enough to piece together a version of him he had clearly never intended to show anyone. And the longer I stayed quiet, the more the weight of it pressed down between us, until finally he spoke, and his voice was exactly the same as it always was, calm, even, controlled, which somehow made it worse. That is mine. And it was not a question, not even remotely, just a statement, simple and precise, like everything else about him. And I swallowed, suddenly aware of how loud even that small movement sounded in the quiet space, aware of how close he was, how impossible it would be to pretend this was anything other than what it was. And I nodded once, a small, automatic motion that did nothing to fix the situation, and for a second I thought, that was it, that he would just take it back and walk away, and we would both pretend none of this had happened. But he did not move, did not reach for it, just stood there watching me with that same steady focus that had always made it hard to look away. And then he added, quieter this time, but somehow more direct, how much did you read? And that was the problem, because there was no good answer to that, no version that would not change something between us, and I felt it then, clear and unavoidable, that whatever I said next was not going to let things go back to the way they were. And for the first time since I picked up that notebook, I was not sure I wanted them to. I opened my mouth and then closed it again because every possible answer sounded worse once I actually tried to say it out loud. And the silence stretched just long enough to make it obvious that I was thinking too hard about something that should have been simple, and his gaze did not waver, did not soften, just steady and patient in a way that felt more like pressure than kindness. And I finally forced something out, quieter than I meant it to be, enough. And it was the truth, just not the full version of it. Not the part that mattered most, not the part where I had kept reading even after I knew I should stop. And for a second nothing changed. His expression stayed exactly the same, composed and unreadable, but I saw it again, that small shift, that almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes like he was recalculating something in real time. And then he took a step closer, not sudden, not aggressive, just enough to close the distance between us in a way that made everything feel sharper, clearer, harder to ignore, and my grip on the notebook tightened without me meaning it to, like I was holding on to something that was no longer just paper and ink, but a version of him I could not unknow. And he noticed that too. Of course he did, his attention flicking briefly to my hands before returning to my face. And when he spoke again his voice was still controlled, but there was something under it now. Something quieter and more difficult to hide. You should not have read it, and that should have been it. That should have been the end of the conversation, a simple correction, a line drawn. But it was not enough, not after everything I had seen, not after the way those words had rearranged something inside me that I could not just put back the way it was, and before I could stop myself, before I could filter it into something safer, something less direct. I heard my own voice cut in, a little sharper than I expected. You should not have written it like that if you did not want anyone to know. And the moment the words left my mouth I felt it, the shift, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet break in the careful control he had been holding on to, like something I said landed exactly where he did not want it to. And for a second he did not respond, did not deflect, did not correct me the way he usually would. And that silence was different from before, heavier, more personal, and I realized with a slow, unsettling clarity that this was the first time I had ever seen him without that immediate defense, without that polished layer of distance he always kept in place, and it made everything feel too close, too real, because now it was not just me trying to understand him, it was him deciding whether or not to let me. And his gaze dropped again, not to the notebook this time, but to the space between us, like he was considering something he had not planned for. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of some of that practiced precision. It was not meant for anyone, and I exhaled something that almost sounded like a laugh, but was not, because that answer only made it worse, only made it more complicated. And I shook my head slightly, not in disagreement, but in disbelief, because there was no way to separate what I had read from what was standing in front of me now. No way to pretend those two versions of him were not the same person, and the question that had been building since I opened that notebook pushed its way out before I could stop it, softer this time, but more direct than anything I had said before. Then why? Is it about me? And that was it. That was the moment everything shifted, because for the first time since I had known Lucas Hayes, he did not have an immediate answer. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full, like something was pressing against the edges of it, waiting for him to decide whether to let it through or keep it locked where it had been all this time. And I could see it happening in real time. The way his jaw tightened slightly, the way his shoulders held just a fraction too still, like even standing there was something he was actively controlling. And it was so different from the version of him I had known for years that it made it hard to look away, because this was not the Lucas Hayes who always had something to say, always had a response ready, always knew exactly how to steer a conversation back into something safe and distant. This was someone who had been caught off guard, someone who had not prepared for this moment. And the realization hit me with a strange kind of weight, because it meant I was seeing something real, something unfiltered, and that made everything feel more fragile than I expected. And when he finally spoke, it was slower, more deliberate, like he was choosing each word carefully instead of letting them come automatically. It is not supposed to be. And I frowned slightly because that did not answer anything. Not really. And he seemed to realize that too. Exhaling quietly like he was already regretting saying anything at all, and for a second I thought he might just stop there, might close this off the way he always did, retreat back into that controlled distance that had defined everything between us for years. But he did not move away, did not break eye contact, and that felt like a decision, like he was choosing to stay in this moment even if he did not know how to handle it. And something about that made my chest tighten again, because it meant this mattered to him more than he was willing to say. And I shifted slightly, adjusting my grip on the notebook without realizing it, and his gaze flicked to it again, quick but sharp, like he could not ignore what it represented now that it was out in the open between us. And I swallowed, forcing myself to hold his gaze even though it would have been easier to look away, easier to pretend this was not happening. But I was past that point now, and so was he, and I heard myself say it before I could second guess it, quieter this time, but more certain. You wrote about me like I mattered. And there it was, the thing neither of us had said out loud yet, the thing that had been sitting underneath every word since I opened that notebook. And I saw it land, saw the way his expression shifted again, not dramatically but enough that I knew I had crossed some invisible line. And for a second he did not respond, just looked at me like he was trying to decide how much of the truth he was willing to let me see. And then he let out a breath that sounded almost like something giving way, something he had been holding on to for too long. And his voice when he spoke again was quieter than I had ever heard it, stripped of the edge that usually defined it. You do. And the words were simple, almost too simple for everything they carried. But they hit harder than anything else he could have said, because there was no distance in them, no deflection, no attempt to soften or redirect, just a statement, direct and undeniable. And my grip on the notebook loosened slightly without me meaning it to. Like something in me had just shifted in response. Like the version of him I had built in my head was finally starting to crack, and I realized with a sudden, overwhelming clarity that this was not just about what he had written. It was about what he was choosing to admit now, standing right in front of me, without the safety of ink and paper to hide behind. And that made everything feel different, heavier, real in a way I was not sure I was ready for, and I did not know what to do with that. Did not know how to respond to something that rewrote so much of what I thought I understood, except that I could not ignore it anymore. Could not pretend it did not change anything, because it already had. The words settled between us in a way that felt heavier than anything that had been said before, not loud, not dramatic, just there, solid and impossible to take back. And for a second I forgot how to respond, forgot how to breathe normally, forgot how to be the version of myself that had spent years navigating around him like he was something sharp I needed to avoid, because this did not fit that version of him, did not fit any version I had allowed myself to consider, and my mind tried to catch up, tried to rearrange everything I thought I knew into something that made sense, but it kept slipping, like I was trying to hold on to something that refused to stay in place, and I realized with a quiet kind of panic that I did not know how to exist in this moment, did not know what role I was supposed to play now that the one I had relied on for so long had been pulled out from under me, and I forced out a breath that sounded steadier than I felt. Then why did you act like that? And I did not need to explain what I meant. Not really, because the history between us filled in the gaps, the years of sharp comments and careful distance, and that constant, underlying tension that I had always interpreted as dislike. And he did not look confused by the question, did not ask me to clarify, which meant he understood exactly what I was asking. And that somehow made it worse, because it meant this had never been accidental, never been something he was unaware of, and he looked away for the first time since this started. Not far, just slightly to the side like he needed a second to think without being watched too closely. And that small break in eye contact felt significant, like something had shifted just enough to show that this was not easy for him either. And when he spoke again, his voice was still quiet, but less controlled, like he had stopped trying to polish every word before letting it out, because it was easier, and I blinked at that, because it was not the answer I expected, not the one that explained anything in a way that made it easier to accept, and I shook my head slightly, almost automatically. Easier for who? And the question came out softer than I intended, less accusatory and more confused, because that was what this was now. Confusion layered over something else I was not ready to name yet, and he let out a breath that sounded faintly frustrated, not at me, but at himself, like he did not like the position he was in any more than I did. And he looked back at me then, meeting my gaze directly again, and there was something different there now, something more open than I had ever seen from him before, something that made it harder to look away even though part of me wanted to. For you, he said, and that stopped me completely, because that did not make sense, not in the way I had understood any of this, and I frowned slightly, trying to process it, trying to figure out how pushing me away, how making me believe he disliked me, could possibly have been the easier option for me, and he seemed to see that, seemed to recognize the confusion written all over my face, because he added, quieter this time, but more certain, you were doing fine without me being anything else, and the hesitation in his words was small but noticeable, like he had almost said something different and chosen not to at the last second, and that detail stuck with me more than the rest, because it hinted at something he still was not saying, something he was still holding back even now, and I tightened my grip on the notebook again without realizing it, grounding myself in something physical, because everything else felt too uncertain, and I looked at him, really looked at him, trying to reconcile the person in front of me with the one I thought I knew. And for the first time it felt like I was seeing both at once, overlapping but not quite aligned, and I realized with a slow, dawning clarity that this was not just about him anymore, not just about what he had written or why he had hidden it. It was about what I was going to do with it now that I knew, because pretending nothing had changed was no longer an option, not when everything already had. His answer should not have made sense, but it did in a way that was almost worse, because it forced me to look at things I had never questioned before, forced me to consider that maybe I had been comfortable with the version of him I thought I understood, even if that version included tension and frustration and the kind of rivalry that made every interaction feel like something to win or lose, because at least that had been clear, at least that had been predictable, and this was not. This was something else entirely. Something that shifted the ground under everything we had built between us without either of us acknowledging it until now, and I found myself searching his expression for something familiar, something I could anchor to, but there was none of that usual distance, none of that quiet superiority that had always put space between us, just this steady, open honesty that made it harder to hide behind my own assumptions, and I realized with a slow, reluctant clarity that if he had been pretending, then I had been reacting to something that was never real in the first place, and that thought made my chest tighten again because it meant I had been wrong, not just about him, but about myself, about the way I had interpreted every look, every word, every moment that had shaped how I felt around him, and I did not like that, did not like the idea that I had built something so certain on something so incomplete, and I exhaled slowly, trying to steady the way my thoughts kept shifting under me. You do not get to decide what is easier for me. And the words came out firmer than I expected, not angry but grounded, like I was trying to reclaim something that had been quietly taken out of my hands without me noticing. and his expression changed again, just slightly, like he had not expected that response, like he had been prepared for something else entirely. And for a second I saw something almost like regret flicker across his face before it was carefully smoothed over. And that detail stuck with me more than anything else, because it was proof that this mattered to him in a way he could not fully control, and I took a small step forward without thinking about it, closing the distance just enough to make the space between us feel intentional, and I held the notebook out toward him, not fully letting go but offering it back, like I was acknowledging what it was while still holding on to what it had shown me. And his eyes dropped to it again, lingering there for a second longer this time, and I wondered what it felt like for him to see it in my hands, to know that everything he had kept hidden in those pages was no longer just his. And when he reached for it, his fingers brushed mine for the briefest moment, nothing dramatic, nothing that should have mattered, but it did. It grounded everything in a way that made this feel more real than anything else had so far. And he took it back slowly, like he was still deciding something even as he moved, and I watched him for a second, watched the way he held it, not tightly but carefully, like it was something fragile even though it had just shattered whatever distance had existed between us, and I heard myself speak again before I could stop it, quieter now, but more certain. You do not get to hide behind it anymore. And his gaze lifted back to mine, sharper this time, more focused, like the words had landed exactly where I intended them to. And for a second neither of us moved, neither of us looked away, and I realized with a quiet certainty that this was no longer about what had been written or what had been hidden. It was about what came next, about whether he would keep pretending or finally stop. And for the first time since I met Lucas Hayes, I was not waiting for him to make the first move. He did not respond right away, and that was new, because Lucas Hayes had always been quick with his words, precise with his reactions, controlled in a way that made it seem like nothing ever caught him off guard. But now he just stood there holding the notebook like it weighed more than it should, like it carried something heavier than paper and ink, and I watched him carefully, waiting, not backing down, not filling the silence the way I normally would when things got uncomfortable, because this time the silence mattered. This time it felt like part of the conversation instead of something to escape from, and I could see it again, that shift in him, subtle but unmistakable, like he was standing at the edge of a decision he had avoided for years. And for a second I wondered if he would retreat, if he would default back to the version of himself that kept everything distant and manageable, if he would say something dismissive and walk away like none of this had changed anything. But he did not, and that realization settled in slowly, steady and undeniable, because instead of stepping back he stayed exactly where he was. And when he finally spoke his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it, not weak, not uncertain, just stripped of everything unnecessary. I know. And the words were simple, almost too simple, but they carried weight, acknowledgement, acceptance, something that told me he understood exactly what I meant when I said he could not hide behind it anymore, and that he was not going to try. And that should have made things clearer, should have made it easier to understand where we stood now, but it did the opposite, because without that distance, without that familiar tension to fall back on, everything felt exposed, uncertain in a way I was not used to, and I shifted slightly, not stepping away but adjusting my stance like I needed to ground myself in something physical, just to keep from overthinking everything happening between us. And he noticed that too. Of course he did, his attention sharp even now, but he did not comment on it, did not point it out, just watched me with that same steady focus that felt different now, less like scrutiny and more like something I did not have a word for yet. And it made my chest feel tight in a way that was not entirely uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. And I realized then that this was not going to resolve itself in one conversation, not after years of misunderstanding, not after everything we had built on top of something that was never quite what it seemed. And that thought should have been overwhelming, should have made me want to step back and put distance between us again, but it did not. And that was the part one could not ignore, because instead of pulling away, I found myself holding my ground, matching his stillness with my own, like I was waiting to see what he would do now that there was nothing left to hide behind. And for a second neither of us moved, neither of us spoke, and then he did something small but significant, something that would have meant nothing before but felt different now. He shifted the notebook in his hands, not closing it off, not tucking it away, just holding it loosely at his side like it was no longer a barrier between us, like it was no longer something he needed to protect from being seen. And that small change said more than anything else he could have, because it meant he was choosing not to retreat, choosing to stay in this moment even if he did not know exactly what came next. And I felt something in my chest ease slightly in response. Not completely, not enough to make this simple, but enough to make it feel possible. And I took a breath, steady this time, and met his gaze again without hesitation, because whatever this was now, whatever we were now, it was not the same as before, and for the first time since I met him, that did not feel like something I needed to avoid. The quiet between us did not feel uncertain anymore. It felt deliberate, like we were both standing in the same moment fully aware that something had shifted and neither of us was pretending otherwise. And that realization settled into me in a way that was both steady and unsettling, because it meant there was no easy way back to what we had before, no comfortable version of distance to fall into. And I realized I did not actually want that, not anymore, not after everything I had seen, everything I had heard, everything he had finally stopped hiding. And I let out a slow breath, more controlled this time, like I was adjusting to something new instead of resisting it. And I tilted my head slightly, studying him in a way I never had before, not as a rival, not as someone I needed to outmaneuver or brace against, but as someone I was trying to understand without the filter of everything I thought I knew. And it was strange how different he looked when I allowed that. How the same expression I had once read as cold now felt more like restraint, like he had been holding something back instead of pushing me away. And I wondered how many times I had misread him without ever questioning it. How many moments I had taken at face value because it was easier than looking closer, and the thought lingered just long enough to make me speak again, quieter but more certain than before. You could have said something. And this time there was no edge to it, no accusation, just a statement of fact, something simple that carried the weight of everything that had not been said for years. And his gaze shifted slightly, not away but softer, like he was considering the question instead of deflecting it. And when he answered, there was a small pause before it, like he was choosing honesty over convenience. I did not think it would change anything, and I blinked at that, because it was not the answer I expected, not something dismissive or self-protective, but something quieter, more vulnerable in a way that felt unfamiliar coming from him. And I frowned slightly, trying to understand it. It would have, I said, and this time I knew it was true, even if I could not fully explain how. Because knowing what I knew now made it impossible to imagine things staying the same if I had understood even a fraction of it back then. And something in his expression shifted again, subtle but real, like he had not considered that possibility in the same way, like he had already decided the outcome before giving it a chance to be anything else. And that thought stayed with me, because it meant we had both been making assumptions, both been reacting to something incomplete, and for a second neither of us spoke again. But it did not feel like avoidance anymore. It felt like space, like we were both processing something at the same time instead of circling around it. And I noticed then how close we were standing, not uncomfortably, not accidentally, just close enough that it felt intentional, like neither of us had stepped back even when we had the chance. And that detail mattered more than I expected, because it meant this was not just words, not just something that would fade once the conversation ended. It was something we were both choosing to stay in. And I shifted slightly, not to create distance but to steady myself, and I met his gaze again without hesitation, because there was something else I needed to say, something that had been building. Since the moment I opened that notebook, something I could not ignore anymore, and when I spoke this time my voice was quieter but more grounded than it had been before. You do not get to decide for me again. And the words settled between us with a quiet certainty, not a challenge, not a rejection, just a boundary. Something clear that did not push him away but did not leave room for the same mistakes either. And I saw it land. Saw the way his expression changed just enough to show he understood. And this time when the silence followed, it did not feel heavy or uncertain. It felt steady, like we had both finally stepped into something honest at the same time. He did not argue with that. And somehow that mattered more than if he had, because Lucas Hayes had never been someone who backed down easily. Never someone who let things settle without pushing them further, refining them, controlling them until they fit into something precise and manageable. But now he just stood there, absorbing the words without deflecting, without reshaping them into something easier to handle. And I could see it in the way his expression shifted, subtle but real, like he was adjusting to a version of this conversation he had never allowed himself to have before, and for a second it felt like we were both standing in unfamiliar territory, not uncomfortable, but not entirely steady either, like learning how to move without the patterns we had relied on for years, and I became aware again of how quiet the library was around us, the distant hum of air conditioning, the faint rustle of pages somewhere far enough away to feel separate from this moment, like the rest of the world had continued on without noticing anything had changed while everything here had. And I let that grounding settle for a second before I spoke again. Not rushing, not forcing it, just letting the words come the way they needed to. So what happens now? And it was a simple question, but it carried more weight than anything else I had said so far, because it was not about the past, not about what he had written or what I had misunderstood. It was about what came next, about whether we would fall back into what was familiar or step into something that neither of us had defined yet. And he seemed to understand that immediately, because his gaze sharpened slightly, not in the old way that felt like a challenge, but in a way that felt focused, intentional, like he was considering the question instead of avoiding it. And for a moment he did not answer, not because he did not have one, but because he was choosing how to say it. And that pause felt different from the others, less about hesitation and more about care, like he was aware that whatever he said next would matter in a way that could not be taken back or reinterpreted later. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, quieter than before, but more certain. That depends on you. And I blinked slightly at that, because it was not what I expected, not an attempt to control the outcome or define it on his own terms, but something that shifted the decision toward me in a way that felt deliberate, like he was acknowledging the boundary I had set. And I let that settle for a second, feeling the weight of it. Because it would have been easier if he had told me what this was supposed to be, easier if he had taken the lead the way he always had in every other interaction between us. But this was different, and I realized with a quiet clarity that he was giving me space to choose whether I wanted to stay in this or step away, whether I wanted to rebuild something from what had just been uncovered or leave it as it was. And that realization steadied something in me, because it meant I was not being pulled into something I did not understand. I was being asked to decide, and for a second I just stood there, looking at him, really looking, taking in the version of him that was no longer hidden behind distance or sharp edges, the version that had always been there, but had never been visible to me until now. And I felt something shift again, quieter this time, but more certain, like a decision settling into place instead of being forced into it. And I exhaled slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I was choosing to be deliberate. And when I spoke, my voice was steady, grounded in a way it had not been before. Then stop acting like you do not care. And the words were simple, but they carried everything I meant, everything I was willing to step into if he met me there. And for a second the silence returned, but it did not feel uncertain anymore. It felt like a pause before something new began. He did not look away this time, did not retreat into that careful distance that had defined him for so long. And that was how I knew something had truly shifted, not just in what he had said, not just in what I had read, but in what he was choosing now, in the way he stayed exactly where he was instead of stepping back, in the way his gaze held mine without that familiar edge, steady and unguarded in a way I had never seen before. And for a moment it felt like everything else fell away, the years of misunderstanding, the tension, the assumptions we had both carried without ever questioning them. All of it narrowing down to this one quiet moment where neither of us was pretending anymore. And I saw it again, that subtle change in him. Not something dramatic, not something obvious, but enough to tell me he had heard me, that he understood exactly what I was asking for. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, but no longer distant, no longer filtered through that layer of restraint that had kept everything just out of reach. "I am not," he said, and the words were simple, but they landed differently now, because for the first time I believed him without hesitation, without second-guessing what he might actually mean, and something in my chest eased in response. Not completely, not enough to erase everything that had come before, but enough to make this feel real, enough to make it feel like something I could step into instead of something I needed to guard against. And I exhaled slowly, not because I was uncertain, but because I was choosing to let go of the version of this I had been holding on to for so long. The version where he was someone I had to brace against, someone I had to read carefully just to keep from being caught off guard. And as that realization settled, I noticed something else, something small but undeniable, the way the space between us no longer felt like something to maintain, like neither of us was measuring it or adjusting for it anymore, just standing there naturally, like this was where we were supposed to be, and that thought should have felt strange, should have felt unfamiliar, but it did not. It felt right in a way I had not expected, and I found myself watching him again, not searching for inconsistencies, not waiting for him to revert back to something easier to understand, but just seeing him as he was. Now, without the filter of everything I thought I knew, and for the first time I did not feel like I was trying to solve something. I felt like I was finally looking at something clearly, and that clarity made the next words easier than I expected, quieter but steady. Then do not start again. And there was no accusation in it, no doubt, just a simple boundary, something that acknowledged where we had been without letting it define where we were going. And he nodded slightly, not exaggerated, not performative, just a small, certain movement that felt more genuine than anything else he could have said, and the silence that followed did not feel heavy or uncertain. It felt settled, like something had finally aligned between us after years of being just slightly off. And I realized then that this was not an ending, not a resolution that tied everything up neatly and left no questions behind. It was something else, something quieter and more open, like a beginning that neither of us had planned but were both choosing to step into anyway. And as I stood there with him, no longer separated by misunderstanding or distance or unspoken assumptions, I understood something I had not allowed myself to consider before, that whatever this was, whatever it became, it would not be built on what we thought we knew about each other. It would be built on what we were finally willing to say. And for the first time since all of this started, that felt like enough.